I'm Nadia, 28 years old, and Thanksgiving in my family has always been a spectacle, a drama waiting to unfold. Every year we cram into my parents' small dining room, plaster on forced smiles, and try not to let old grudges bubble over. It's a balancing act, and every year we barely manage to keep from toppling over. But this year I promised myself it would be different. I'd spent months working on setting boundaries and letting go of the idea that I had to fix everything for everyone. This Thanksgiving felt like my ultimate test. The moment I walked into my parents' house, I knew peace was going to be an uphill battle. The tension hit me like a wall. It wasn't even noon, and already the place buzzed with unspoken grievances. My mom, Eleanor, was in the kitchen, barking orders while wrestling with a turkey that looked seconds from catastrophe. The faint smell of burnt stuffing lingered in the air, accompanied by the cacophony of clattering dishes and clinking glasses. He gave me a quick hug before leaning in close to whisper, "Please, Nadia, just try to get along with everyone today. It's Thanksgiving, and it would mean so much if you could fall in line for once." T was classic Eleanor. Appearance was everything to her, no matter what chaos simmered beneath the surface. I gave her a tight smile, more for her sake than mine, and wandered into the living room, where the first act of the day's drama waited. Lila swooped in almost immediately. She did this every year, and I'd learned to brace myself for her inquisition. True to form, she launched into a spiel about my career. "Still working that same job, Nadia? With your degree, you could be doing so much more, you know." No, Ted the urge to roll my eyes and forced out a polite response, but my patience wore thin. Before I could catch my breath, Uncle Terry chimed in from the couch, eyes glued to his phone. "Looks like you've gained a bit of weight," he said flatly, not even glancing up. No hup, no pleasantries, just that. My stomach knotted, but I let it slide. The knot tightened when my sister Victoria appeared, flashing her practiced too sweet smile. Victoria, always the golden child, wasted no time before asking, "Still single? All single?" Asians in the room seemed to pause, and suddenly I was the center of attention. Victoria's follow-up jab, "No kids yet either, huh?" hit its mark as usual. I gave her a stiff smile and turned back to the kitchen, desperate for an escape. But Tescape. No reprieve there. My dad, Arthur, sidled up to me, speaking in his typical calm-before-the-storm voice. "How's work, Nadia?" he started, before casually transitioning to, Your brother Connor is having a tough time financially. Maybe you could help him out a little, just until he gets back on his feet." It took feet. Ounce of willpower not to ask when, exactly, Connor had ever been on his feet. I bit my tongue and nodded noncommittally. But inside, the frustration built. By the time Bill TT down for dinner, I was ready to explode. Eleanor noticed I wasn't piling mashed potatoes onto my plate and couldn't help but comment, "Oh, come on, Nadia, just a little. We're all eating the same. It's family." Ignoring the fact that I had dietary restrictions she knew about, she reached over and plopped a heap onto my plate anyway. I clenched anyway. The tension around the table thickened. Victoria's perfect, gleaming engagement ring practically blinded me as she waved her hand around, dropping not-so-subtle hints about her successful marriage and life choices. Each pointed remark about my lifestyle landed like a punch, but I stayed silent, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Then, as if reaction. Leaner dabbed at her eyes and launched into a nostalgic monologue. "Thanksgiving used to mean so much to us," she said, her voice trembling. "It hurts me to see my kids not getting along." Her words cracked open the dam, and the familiar torrent of old grievances spilled out. Blame was passed around like the turkey, with much of it landing squarely on me for sins they claimed I committed years ago. I tried to stay cago at their accusations, and jabs wore me down. Just as I felt myself unraveling, my younger cousin Max leaned over and whispered, "Hey, don't let them get to you. I see what's going on." It was a small gestuine, but in that moment it meant everything. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to hold back the rising frustration. The final straw came when they started mocking my so-called obsession with work-life balance. I'd worked hard to build a career I was proud of, but their laughter made it clear they thought my priorities were laughable. I couldn't take laughable. Standing up, I grabbed my coat without a word and headed for the door. There was no dramatic speech or tearful explanation, just the sound of my footsteps as I left. Their shocked silence followed me outside, and by the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed with the first of many messages. They called me selfish, dramatic, and everything in between, but for the first time in years I didn't care. Driving away, I felt so unfamiliar, freedom. The fallout began almost the moment I left my parents' driveway. My phone lit up with missed calls and messages, each one a fresh jab at my resolve. By the time I got home, there were more than a dozen notifications waiting for me. I ignored most of them, but curiosity got the better of me, and I opened my mom's voicemail first. Her voice cracked with D first. Flare as she asked, "Nadia, how could you just walk out like that? After everything I've done to make Thanksgiving special for everyone?" I could practically see her dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the part of the heartbroken matriarch. Every word was designed to tug at my guilt, and it almost worked. Next came the texts from worked daughter, Connor. He wasn't one for subtlety. His messages were blunt and furious. "You're selfish. You're immature. You think you're too good for us now?" He fired off a barrage of accusations, not bothering to ask why I left or what had pushed me to my breaking point. His anger was palpable, and I could feel it radiating from every text. He didn't want a conversation. He wanted someone to blame. My dad, Arthur, followed whitblame.gh different approach. He started with a string of missed calls before finally sending a long text. It was a mix of apology and guilt-tripping. "I'm sorry things got heated, Nadia," he wrote. "But family holidays are stressful. You know how people say things they don't mean. Let's just keep the peace. Family is all we have in the end." I read his words twice, unsure if he meant them, or if he was just trying to smooth things over for appearances. Then there was Aunt Lila appearances.m, she had to insert herself into the drama. Her text dripped with condescension. "Thanksgiving is a time for family, Nadia. You ruined it for everyone. Your poor mother is devastated. You should call her and apologize." I rolled my eyes and put my phone down, too drained to respond. But the strangest part? Silence respond. Kitoria, my sister, queen of passive aggressiveness, didn't say a word. No calls, no texts, nothing. Her silence was louder than all the other messages combined, and I knew she was punishing me in her own way. That was Victoria's style. Let everyone else do the shouting while she sat back, playing the victim in the wings. It was too much. The guilt, the knowings, a constant barrage of texts and calls, it all felt like an anchor, dragging me back into a storm I desperately wanted to escape. So I did something I'd never done before. I blocked my mom and Connor, at least temporarily. I needed space, and this was the only way I could get it. I kept Arthur unblocked, along with my cousin Max, who had been the only person remotely supportive that day. Everyone else, they were cut off for now. The next morning, my friends came over arranging coffee and snacks. I told them everything, spilling out the events of the previous day like I was unloading bricks from a backpack. They listened, shaking their heads at my family's antics. "Honestly, I'm proud of you," my friend Serena said, handing me a mug of tea. "You've been dealing with this for years, and it's about time you stood up for yourself." Her words gave me a sense of relieve yourself, any lifeline in the sea of chaos. For the first time, I felt validated. We spent the day laughing, venting, and distracting me from the mess my family had left behind. For a few precious hours, the weight of it all lifted, but reality came crashing back that eve lifted. Arthur texted again. This time, his message was shorter and sharper. "Blocking your family isn't the answer, Nadia. You'll regret burning bridges." I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. His earlier attempts to play peacemaker had vanished, replaced by frustration that I wasn't falling back in line. Then there was Max, sweet, quiet Max, who lined out just to say he understood. His message was simple. "I'm sorry for what happened. I get why you left. Don't let them make you feel bad about it." It wasn't much, but it meant the world to me. In a family full of people who thought I owed them something, Max's small show of empathy felt like a lifeboat. The following week, I brought everything lifeboat.apist. I'd been seeing her for years, and she'd heard enough about my family to know this was the breaking point. She listened patiently as I recounted the Thanksgiving fiasco and the fallout. "You're doing the right thing, Nadia," she said, her tone firm yet kind. "Setting boundaries is hard, especially with family, but you don't owe anyone your peace." Her words stayed with me. For years I'd let peace. Aita, the fixer. The one who absorbed everyone else's problems and made sure everything stayed afloat. But this time, I wasn't willing to sink for their sake. Still, the guilt lingered. Every missed call and text chipped away at my resolve. And when I scrolled through my mom's latest message, a long list of all the ways I'd supposedly hurt the family over the years, I felt the familiar tug of doubt. Had I overreacted? Was I the selfish one? No, I shook the thoughts away. I blocked her number 1 alongside Arthur's. The silence that followed was eerie but freeing. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself to anyone. I focused on work, friends, and carving out a life that felt like mine, free from the endless demands of family drama. It wasn't easy. The guilt still gnawed at me, and drama backlash wasn't over. But for now, I was holding the line. I wasn't just walking away. I was choosing myself. The silence didn't last long. Within a week, whispers about what happened at Thanksgiving started making their way back to me. My phone buzzed with messages from friends asking if everything was okay. Some were genuinely concerned. Others sounded suspiciously judgmental, their tones steeped in whatever version of the story my family had fed them. It didn't take long to piece together what was happening. Family had mobilized their network, twisting the story into something that made me the villain. My mom, Eleanor, apparently went full force, painting me as ungrateful and dramatic. She called extended relatives, mutual acquaintances, even some of my friends, lamenting how I had abandoned the family on Thanksgiving. Then there was Victoria. True to her style, she Thanksgiving.aggressive route. She started posting vague updates on social media, her favorite battleground. One selfie with Eleanor had a caption that read, "Some people just don't value family until it's too late." The comments underneath were flooded with sympathy, strangers and distant relatives chiming in with prayers and advice about keeping family together. It was almost funny, if it weren't so calculated. But the final straw came when a friend of mine reached calculated.sed and hesitant. "Nadia, I don't know what's true, but your sister told someone that you humiliated your parents and refused to participate in Thanksgiving traditions. What's going on? Humiliated? Refused? They'd spun my quiet exit into some Grandin? Ayal." It stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd already distanced myself, but knowing they were working so hard to make me look bad felt like a punch in the gut. Victoria, with her perfect marriage and her carefully crafted image, was particularly relentless. She wanted me to feel like the outcast, the problem child who didn't know how to respect her family. Even Max, my one ally in the chaos, seemed to be wavering. He familied me one night, sounding conflicted. "I get why you're upset," he wrote, "but maybe you could try to see things from their perspective too. They're hurting, Nadia." I stared at the message for a long time. I knew Max wasn't try Nadia. It tripped me, but hearing him echo the family's sentiment felt like a betrayal, no matter how softly he framed it. He'd been the only person I trusted to see the situation for what it was. Now, even he seemed caught in their web. It didn't stop there. Eleanor, ever the master manipulator, found new BS to spread her narrative. She posted in a local community group on Facebook, writing some vague but clearly targeted message about how heartbreaking it was to be abandoned by family. Comments poured in, full of unsolicited advice and pity for my mom. I could feel their judgment like a spotlight, even though I wasn't named outright. I thought about responding. There were moments when I wanted to outright version of the story to set the record straight, but I knew that would only fuel the fire. They wanted a reaction. They thrived on it. So I stayed quiet, even as the rumors grew. Instead, I focused on the people who stood by me. My friend Serena was grew.whore through all of it. "Let them talk," she said one night over coffee. "The people who really matter know who you are, Nadia. You don't need to explain yourself to anyone." She was right. The smear campaign showed me who my real friends were. Anyone. They distanced themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. But the ones who stayed? They were the kind of people I wanted in my life. My circle got smaller, but it felt stronger too. I found comfort in their unwavering support. Therapy became my lifeline. I spent hours unraveling the years of Manipu support. An obligation I'd carried. My therapist reminded me of something that stuck. "You're not responsible for their reactions, Nadia. Setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish. It makes you human." I clung to that truth, even as Eleanor ramped up her efforts. She started Schumann. Long emails, each one more dramatic than the last. She wrote about how much I was hurting the family, how I was breaking her heart, how my actions were tearing everything apart. Her words were crafted to sting, and for a moment they did. But then I saw them for what they were, an attempt to pull me back under her control. The guilt was persistent, a quiet hum in the back of my mind. But for the fight control, it wasn't louder than my resolve. I didn't owe them an apology for protecting myself. I didn't owe them my peace. By the end of the month, I made a decision. I would go completely no contact. I blocked most of them, but this time, I meant it. No more emails, no more texts, no more room for manipulation. I left Max unblocked. I wasn't ready to sever that tie completely, but everyone else? They were out. The silence was immediate. No more buzzing phone, no more guilt-laden messages or bout.ded apologies. At first it felt strange, like the calm before a storm. But as the days went by, I realized how much lighter I felt. Without their voices in my ear, I could finally hear my own. I filled my time with things I loved, things I'd neglected for years. I signed up for aon.ing class, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the energy for. I pulled out my old paints and brushes, rediscovering the joy of creating for the sake of it. And slowly, I started to feel like myself again. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by my family's expectations. I was just again figuring out who I was without the weight of their opinions. It wasn't easy, and I knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but for the first time it felt like my road, and I was ready to walk it. After weeks of silence, my life started to feel like it was finally my own. No more guilt-ridden texts, no more walking on eggshells to keep the peace, just the quiet I'd been craving. But the holidays were creeping closer, and with them came an undercurrent of anxiety. This would be my first Thanksgiving without my family, and despite everything, it felt strange. Serena and a few other close friends invited me to their holiday dinner. At first, I was strange. Spending Thanksgiving with friends instead of family felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready for. But the thought of sitting alone while they enjoyed a warm, tension-free celebration was unbearable. Finally, I accepted. The day itself was different in the best way possible. We cooked together in Serena's accepted hen, laughing over lead flour and slightly burnt rolls. We shared stories over dinner, none of which involved pointed jabs or forced smiles. It wasn't perfect, but it was light, joyful, and uncomplicated. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking into a battlefield on Thanksgiving. When I drove home that night, I realized how peaceful the holiday could be, and how much I'd been missing that my entire life. The absence of my family's chaos gave me room to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. I threw memelife.in to hobbies I'd long neglected. The cooking class became a weekly highlight, and each new recipe felt like a small victory. Painting, which had once been my escape as a teenager, now became a way to process the emotional weight of everything I'd been through. As I layered colors onto canvas, it felt like I was peeling back layers of myself, rediscovering parts of me I'd forgotten exist the canvas. Then my career flourished. With no constant stream of family drama draining my energy, I coexisted. I tackled projects I'd been avoiding and impressed my boss with my newfound productivity. A few months later, I earned a promotion, something I'd worked hard for but had always felt overshadowed by family obligations. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. But as my world opened up, my family's attempts to pull me back in started to creep in again. Thriving.eng, I got a message from Max. It wasn't accusatory or guilt-laden, just a simple update. They're still upset, but I think they've accepted you're serious about your boundaries, he wrote. It was a small but meaningful olive branch. Max had always been the one person who seemed to understand my need for space, and hearing this from him gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, the others might eventually come around. Not long after, I received a text from Victoria. It was short and to the point. I'm sorry for my around, everything. I hope we can talk one day. I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Her message felt rushed, more like checking a box than a heartfelt apology. Still, I decided to acknowledge it. Thanks for reaching out. I still need some space, but I appreciate the message. I sent it and didn't think much about it after. Then came an email from Eleanor. Long and dripping with guilt, it detailed how the family had been after, since I left, how much she missed me, and how my absence had cast a shadow over everything. She listed every way she believed I'd hurt them, as though I needed a reminder of the ripple effects my decision had caused. I read her words carefully, feeling that familiar tug of guilt in my chest. But this time I saw throw-caused. Every sentence was crafted to pull me back, to make me doubt myself. Instead of responding, I deleted the email. I knew better now. My peace wasn't up for negotiation. When Christmas rolled around, Serena invited me to join her family for their celebrations. I'd grown negotiation.er parents and siblings over the years, and their warm welcome felt like stepping into a different world. There was laughter, light teasing, and a sense of togetherness that didn't come with strings attached. For once, I felt what family was supposed to be, not a battlefield, but a refuge. By the time the new year arrived, I realized just how much I'd grown. I wasn't just surviving my decision refuge.ties, I was thriving because of it. Therapy continued to ground me, helping me process the deep wounds left by years of manipulation and obligation. My therapist often reminded me, you can love them and still choose yourself. Those words became my mantra. Of course, the guilt still crept, us. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I'd wonder if I ended things differently. Could I have communicated better? Could I have stayed without losing myself? But every time the answer was the same. No, I'd tried everything I could to make it work, and it wasn't enough because it wasn't just about me. It was about a family dynamic that refused to change unless I stepped away. For months, I didn't hear from Eleanor or Arthur. Their silence was deafening, but it also gave me the space away to finally heal. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I started to believe that I could build a life that wasn't tied to their expectations. Then, one day in early spring, I came home to find a letter in my mailbox. The handwriting was unmistakable expectations. Shaky and deliberate. I hesitated, the envelope heavy in my hands. Did I really want to open this door again? Part of me wanted to toss it in the trash, to protect the peace I'd worked so hard to find. But another part of me, the part that still hoped they might final trash or stand, told me to read it. I set the letter on the counter, deciding to bring it up in my next therapy session before making any decisions. My lit. Felt full for the first time in years, and I wasn't sure I was ready to let their words disrupt that. The letter from Eleanor sat on my counter for days, a silent reminder of everything I'd walked away from. Every time I passed it, I felt a mix of curiosity and dread. My therapist encouraged me to open it, not out of obligation, but to see if there was real change behind their words. I finally sat down, took a deep breath, and unfolded the paper. The first lines were shaky, her usual dramatic tone replaced by something softer. Eleanor wrote about how much she paper. But for the first time, she didn't lace her words with guilt. She admitted things I never thought she'd acknowledge, how she had pushed me into roles that weren't mine to bear, how her need to keep the family together had come at my expense. She even admitted to the manipulation, saying she hadn't realized how damaging her actions had been until I left. Arthur's part followed, and while it was brief, it surprised me. He admitted that he'd avoided addressing family issues, left ears, thinking it was easier to sweep things under the rug. He wrote that he regretted not stepping in when he should have, and that he was willing to go to therapy if it meant repairing our relationship. For a man who'd spent decades keeping his emotions locked away, this was monumental. Even Connor and Victoria had added notes. Connor's was begrudging, but he admitted to taking me for granted, always monumental, did be there to bail him out. Victoria's note was more straightforward, an apology for her part in the Thanksgiving chaos and the smear campaign that followed. While her words felt rushed, they were still more genuine than anything she'd said before. At the end of the letter, Eleanor proposed a meeting, suggesting we attend family therapy together to work through before. "I'll respect your boundaries, Nadia," she wrote. "We'll do whatever it takes." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Their words didn't erase the hurt they'd caused, but they showed it takes to try, to understand. I took a few days to process before drafting my response. I told them I was open to a meeting, but only on my term it would happen in a neutral setting, with a therapist present, and they would need to come prepared to respect the boundaries I'd set. No excuses, no backtracking. To my surprise, they agreed. The day of the meeting, I arrived at the therapist's office early, my stomach twisting with backtracking. I sat in the waiting room, agreed. Read if this was a mistake. Could they really change? Or was this just another attempt to pull me back into the same old dynamics? When they arrived, they looked just as nervous as I felt. Eleanor clutched her purse tightly, Arthur's shoulders were stiff, and even Connor and Victoria seemed subdued. The therapist opened the session by setting ground rules: no interruptions, no dismissing each other's feelings, and a focus on subdued ding rather than blaming. Eleanor spoke first, her voice trembling as she apologized. For once, she didn't deflect or shift the blame. She admitted how her actions had pushed me away, how she'd prioritized appearances over my well-being. "I was wrong, Nadia," she said. "I didn't see what I was doing to you." Arthur followed, his tone heavy with regret. He admitted to failing me by staying silent, by letting things fester instead of address you. I thought keeping the peace was enough," he said, "but I see now it wasn't." Connor surprised me the most. He owned up to his behavior, acknowledging how often he'd relied on me without considering the toll it wasn't. "I'm sorry," he said simply, his usual defensiveness absent. Even Victoria, always the one to dodge accountability, admitted that her actions after Thanksgiving had been hurtful. "I let my pride get in the way," she said. "I should have been better." For the first time, they listened, really listened, as I explained how their words and actions had affected me. I talked about the press better, to keep the family together, the resentment I carried from years of being dismissed and undermined. They didn't interrupt. They didn't argue. They just sat with it, their expressions a mix of guilt and realization. When the session ended, I felt lighter. It wasn't a perfect resolution, far from it, but it was a start. For the first time, I believe realization actually respect the boundaries I'd fought so hard to establish. We agreed to keep working through things in therapy, meeting regularly to rebuild our relationships on healthier terms. Over the next few months, the dynamic shifted. We weren't suddenly a picture-perfect family, but there was progress. Eleanor stopped trying terms-ing me into attending every family gathering. Arthur made an effort to communicate more openly, even if it was awkward at times. Connor and Victoria stayed quieter, less quick to judge or criticize. And Max? He was quietly supportive as always, though now it felt like the family's weight wasn't solely on my shoulders. I kept my boundaries firm, limiting contact and prioritizing my peace above all else. The holidays came and went, and while I chose to shoulders friends again, the guilt I once felt was gone. My family had their traditions, and I had my newfound freedom. For the first time, it felt like both could coexist without tearing me apart. As the seasons changed, so did I. Therapy remained a constant, guiding me as I navigated this new chapter of my life. My career continued to float. My hobbies filled me with joy, and my circle of friends grew stronger. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving, in a way I never thought possible. Looking back, I realized how much I'd grown. The decision to walk away wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It forced my family to confront their possible, and gave me the space to heal. We were still a work in progress, but for the first time I felt hopeful. This was my life, on my terms. And I wasn't going back. Story 2. For as long as I can remember, my relationship with my 28-year-old elder brother has been tumultuous. I am a 25-year-old woman. He was always viewed as the ideal child growing up, incapable of doing any wrong, regardless of how much wrong he committed. In the meantime, I was the reserved one, the one who was disregarded and undervalued, particularly following the disaster. I had restricted movement in my right leg after a strange playground accident when I was 7 years old. Although I can walk, I limp, and anything that needs physical exertion necessitates extra work and modifications. My brother thought it was amusing right away. It started out with little barbs, such as calling me hop-along or mimicking my limp. I assumed he would get over it, but as we grew older, His jokes got more scathing and cruel, and the worst part? My family always dismissed it as harmless banter. My relatives, uncles, and parents would laugh and shake their heads. "That's only him, I see. Don't let it affect you," they would say. I made an effort to ignore it, but it drained me. When the people who ought to support you make you feel like you're overreacting because you've been hurt, it's difficult to remain strong. A prime example was the most recent family meal. When our family went trekking last year, my brother was in full swing, making loud jokes about how I required special accommodations. For laughter, he exaggerated my limp and imitated me begging for assistance on a path. As if it were a comedy performance, everyone at the table laughed along. My dad even gave him a pat on the back as if he had just cracked the greatest joke ever. I pretended the mashed potatoes on my plate were the most intriguing thing in the world while I sat there with my cheeks burning. For some reason, that moment stayed with me, even though it wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. Perhaps it was the way, after laughing, my mother looked at me as if to challenge me to speak. Perhaps it was simply the sheer fatigue of constantly being the target of jokes when I arrived home that evening. I let myself stew and started my small flat. I'm frustrated, not depressed. I'm not weak. For me, I have created a life. I've managed do-it-yourself projects, learned to swim, and even established a strong profession in software development despite my impairment. I quote put a lot of effort into building a self-sufficient, satisfying existence, but my brother and, consequently, my family were unable to look past my limp. That evening, I made the decision to stop allowing them to define who I am. The first thing I did was call my best friend Olivia. She has been my pillar of support for years, and she didn't mince words when I told her what had happened. She stated, "You don't need their approval. Pay attention to yourself. Give them a taste of what they're missing." I made the identical decision to do it. I began by making my residence more accessible, a project I had been thinking about for a long. There was a time when my brother made a joke about my apartment being like an obstacle course for people with disabilities. He wasn't incorrect, even though I detested the way he delivered it. It was a challenge to me. Over the following few weeks, I started working after researching ideas and placing an internet order for materials. I rearranged furniture, made specialized ramps, and even installed an automatic door system. It wasn't simple. I spent more nights buried in sawdust than I'd care to admit, and I had to learn a lot of new skills. However, the outcomes were worthwhile. I felt like I owned my flat for the first time. I had a breakthrough at work around the same time. I had been fighting for and didn't think I would be given the opportunity to head a significant project until my manager requested me to do so. Despite the enormous burden, I immersed myself into it. After the project was completed satisfactorily, I was given a bonus in addition to a promotion. I felt as though I was finally being thrown a bone by the world. My family realized something was off, of course. I began avoiding my brother completely, missing family dinners, and responding to texts less frequently. My parents began phoning more frequently, encouraging me to speak with him and let the past go. But I didn't back down. Until my brother demonstrated real change, I wasn't going to interact, and up until now, all I'd received were a few caustic messages explaining why he was given the silent treatment. I discovered a new community in the meanwhile. Olivia had been pushing me to join a local adapted sports club for a long time, so I did. Although the first session was nerve-wracking, I ended up making friends who truly understood what it was like to live with a handicap. They were more than simply encouraging, they were motivational. I even developed a talent for wheelchair basketball, something I never imagined I'd like but now find really entertaining. I felt for the first time in a long time that I was creating a life that was independent of my brother and his beliefs. I wasn't attempting to convince him of anything. To myself, I was proving it. And to be honest, nothing felt better than that. According to Update 128, things have been going quickly but in the greatest possible way. I became aware of how much simpler my life might be when I had control over my surroundings after completing the initial set of changes to my residence. For the first time, I felt like I was making a statement with the automatic door system and bespoke ramps. I was designing an environment that complemented me rather than working against me. Olivia shared a little video showcasing the improvements on social media, comparing the before and after shots. Until the alerts began to come in, I didn't give it any thought. Commenters praised the idea's inventiveness and their potential to assist others facing comparable difficulties. Some even sought guidance on improving accessibility in their own areas. To be honest, it was a little overwhelming and odd. The finest aspect? My brother also witnessed it. Shortly after the video was posted, he texted me. His dismissiveness and sarcasm were usual. It had to do with how I was using it to further my own agenda, and how others were only interested in me because I was playing the victim. I didn't answer. When I was finally getting underway, I wasn't going to let him pull me back into his negativity. In the meantime, the large project I've been overseeing at work was coming to a close. Despite the tight schedule, we succeeded, and the client was overjoyed. My boss personally thanked me and informed me of my promotion when they summoned me into their office. Additionally, I was eligible for a bonus, which allowed me to continue updating my flat without using any of my funds. It seemed as though all of the effort was finally paying off. My folks saw that I hadn't been around much recently, of course. They began phoning more frequently to inquire as to why I hadn't returned my brother's SMS or attended Sunday meals. It was not long before the guilt trip began. They wanted me to take charge and make amends with him. I informed them that I had no desire to maintain harmony by acting as though nothing was wrong. My brother had to accept responsibility for his treatment of me if he desired a relationship. They weren't happy about that. They attempted to dispute, but I repeated the same point in a calm, steady voice. Unless there was real responsibility, I wasn't talking to him. For the first time, they didn't resist as strongly, even if they didn't enjoy it. Perhaps they were beginning to notice that I was no longer the quiet person who listened to my brother's remarks at the dinner table. I began going to the weekly meetings of the adapted sports group Olivia had located for me at this point. Admittedly, I was first anxious. They were kind and supportive, but the most of the folks present appeared much more seasoned and self-assured than I was. I soon started playing wheelchair basketball after they showed me the ropes. I'm actually rather excellent at it, or competent enough to compete in a game. I began to look forward to each session, but it was a thrill. As significant as the physical component was the social component. I got to know folks who knew what it was like to live with a handicap. They were more than simply encouraging. They honored everyone, regardless of size. Compared to the dynamic I was accustomed to with my family, it seemed quite different. After watching Olivia's film of my apartment improvements, one of my new group mates recommended that I tell more about my experience. At first, I wasn't sure, but I accepted an invitation to speak at an event from a local adaptive living organization. Standing up there discussing my stories felt empowered, and the occasion was little but significant. Inquiries are insightful, and several people even approached me afterwards to express gratitude for telling my tale. Despite all that was going on, my brother remained loyal to himself. He texted me a couple more nasty things, but I wasn't as bothered by them anymore. I didn't need his approval, and I wasn't going to let his pessimism stop me. A few weeks later, I took part in a local 5-kilometer adapted race, which was one of the most fulfilling experiences. It wasn't simple. After weeks of training and pushing myself beyond my comfort zone, I felt invincible as I crossed the finish line. I was demonstrating to myself that I was capable of doing things that my brother had always claimed were impossible, in addition to disproving him. My mental health has significantly improved when I began reducing the number of family visits. I still communicate with my parents on occasion, but I've made it plain that I'm putting myself first at the moment. For me, the distance has been beneficial. Supportive friends and co-workers who recognize my potential are all around me and encourage me at every turn. In retrospect, I'm amazed at how much has changed in such a short period of time. I once believed that my brother's opinion was important and that I needed his blessing to feel deserving. I see now how foolish that was. I don't need his or anybody else's approval to keep going since my progress speaks for itself. Update. During a family cookout that my parents held, 2 things reached a breaking point. My mom pleaded with me to go, saying it would be a low-key, family-only event, even though I had been avoiding these get-togethers. I consented against my better judgment. I could sense the tension in the room as soon as I stepped in. My parents lingered around, attempting to keep the mood light, while my brother held court as usual, laughing loudly at his own jokes. I stayed on the periphery of the gathering, talking to a relative I hadn't seen in a long time, when my brother suddenly spotted me and came running over. He let out a loud grumble about how my refusal to interact with him was making everyone uneasy. He said that by refusing to let things go, I was creating drama and playing the victim. The backyard fell silent. We had everyone's attention. I didn't speak louder. I didn't flinch at all. I just explained that it wasn't about playing the victim when I established boundaries with him. It was to keep me at ease. He appeared surprised at how calm my tone was. I didn't bite when he stuttered something about how I was overreacting. Instead, he stood there in front of everyone as I turned and left. Later, my cousin drew me aside as I was going to the kitchen to get a drink. She acknowledged that she had always thought his actions were excessive and expressed her pride in me for confronting him. For the first time, a family member publicly recognized what I had been going through for years. I didn't realize how much that little moment of approval mattered. In the meantime, work had been going really well. I was nominated by my supervisor for an industry award that honors creativity and adaptable technology. I'm grateful for the project I oversaw. It was a victory just to get nominated, but I couldn't help but smile when I saw my name on the shortlist when it was announced. I was energized by the acknowledgement, and soon after, I began to see other chances opening up. My brother couldn't leave it alone, of course. During one group text discussion, he began to use passive-aggressive language whenever he had the opportunity. He made a joke about how some individuals were concentrating on things that were truly important rather than fishing for trophies. No one else laughed, and it wasn't subtle. He was obviously attempting to get under my skin, but I didn't answer. I was shocked to see how some members of the family began to change their minds. A few days after the BBQ, my aunt phoned to see how I was doing. She acknowledged that she and a few others had been discussing it and concurred that my brother's actions had become excessive. Although it wasn't a whole family intervention, it seemed like a step in the right direction. I reached a significant fitness milestone around this time. I quote, "We've been training consistently since the 5K, and I finally finished one of the adapted sports challenges I've been working on with a personal best. Although it was a little victory, it fueled the flames." My story was even included in the local media, which covered my support of adaptable living. It felt incredible to see my picture printed with a headline that praised my accomplishments. Naturally, my brother didn't take it well. In our family group chat, he lost it and accused me of attempting to discredit me and get attention. The rest of the family didn't pay attention to him, but I did. A few family members resisted, begging him to quit being so resentful and give me the opportunity. Like some sort of theatrical departure, he hurried out of the chat, leaving a trail of emojis in his wake. I made the decision to begin treatment while all of this was going on. I wanted to process things in a healthy way since the years of derision and rejection had worn me down. My therapist assisted me in seeing the extent to which my brother's remarks had ingrained themselves into my perception of myself. For the first time, I began to let go of the notion that I needed to feel worthy in order to get his or anybody else's favor. Motivated by this fresh viewpoint, I started organizing something I had been too scared to attempt for years: an individual journey. My brother used to make fun of me for even thinking of going alone, claiming that I couldn't last a day without assistance, even though I had always fantasized of doing so. I didn't ask for anyone's opinion this time. I began looking at places to visit and determining how to modify the trip to accommodate my demands. It was freeing to think of seeing the world as I saw fit. The ultimatum followed. In a lengthy, meandering text, my brother demanded a face-to-face meeting to resolve the matter. He maintained that without working things out, we couldn't proceed. I informed him that I was amenable to a discussion, but only if he would be prepared to honor my limits and approach it with sincere responsibility. His answer? Silence on the radio. That quiet said a lot. It strengthened my resolve to prioritize myself and not let his pessimism to rule my life. I felt more determined than ever as I planned my trip and anticipated the prospects that were ahead. I had given up trying to disprove him. I wanted to prove myself correct, Update 3. I had dreamed of going on a solo journey for years, but I had never dared to do it because of all the worries my family, especially my brother, had sown. It took me weeks to finalize my itinerary and a lot of second guessing. A national park known for its beautiful trails and ease of entry. I looked into renting adapted equipment, planned out transportation, and reserved an accessible accommodation. I felt like I was getting closer to realizing that I couldn't accomplish this alone with each step. Olivia's helpful advice on preparing, navigating new areas, and being safe was invaluable. She even assisted me in getting used to taking public transportation, something I had avoided for years due to concerns about accessibility. I felt as ready as I could be by the time the day of travel arrived. Naturally, my folks weren't overjoyed. The previous evening they gave me a call. Voice and worries regarding my alone travels. My mother continued saying the same things my brother used to say, including that it was too risky and that I should wait till I had a companion. Despite their skepticism, I reassured them as courteously as possible. It wasn't about him or them on this journey. When the time finally arrived, I prepared my belongings, took a quick social media snapshot, and left. I received a very nice reaction from my followers, the most of whom had become my followers following Lydia's video of my apartment improvements. People were sending me messages wishing me luck and encouraging me. It seemed like a modest yet impactful farewell. The bus ride to the park went off without a hitch on the first flight. I started talking to Claire, a woman who was also traveling alone and who, like me, had encountered her share of difficulties. It was also her first time traveling alone, and she was in a wheelchair. We linked right away and shared tales about the challenges we had faced and our travel objectives. We had already swapped numbers and made plans to meet again later that week. By the time we got to the park, I went exploring as soon as I was comfortable in my cabin. I was able to navigate the trails much more easily since I had borrowed an adapted trekking pole and a lightweight leg brace. I took on a somewhat challenging path that I had been eyeing since my research period on the second day. It wasn't simple. I continued despite the rough routes and steep parts. It seemed like the world was on top of you as you arrived at the viewpoint at the finish. A park ranger started talking to me while I was lying there. She asked if she could take a picture for the park's social media page after being impressed by the work I did. Although I didn't give it much thought at the time, I agreed, and the post became viral on the internet. My phone was ringing with alerts from folks who had commented on how inspirational the tale was by the time I returned to my cabin. My brother, of course, had to add his voice. He implied that I was starving for attention in a sarcastic text he sent me regarding my self-promotion. I didn't respond. I choose to ignore his criticism by reading the encouraging remarks left by both friends and complete strangers. Claire and I got together again for a simpler path on the third day. We ended up discussing our experiences, from the minor triumphs to the more significant setbacks, for the majority of the afternoon. She invited me to connect with her team when I returned home, mentioning that she worked in adaptive technology. The prospect of working together on something worthwhile seemed like an added bonus to a journey that was already life-changing. By the end of the week, I had achieved more than I ever imagined. I managed to get through a whole day's worth of tasks without help, setting up my equipment, climbing a challenging incline, or simply taking in the tranquility of the wilderness, all of which my brother had always claimed I couldn't manage, felt like evidence of how far I'd come. I paused at the cabin window to watch the sunset on my final night there. There was more to the trip than proving anything to anybody. I'd been trying to prove it to myself. I didn't require the affirmation of my parents or the approval of my brother. At last, I was capable, self-sufficient, and living my life as I saw fit. I told Olivia and a few friends about the trip's highlights when I got home. They were ecstatic for me, and Claire even followed up to inquire about the possibility of working together. My parents, on the other hand, were hesitant when I mentioned the trip. I could tell they were holding back their doubts, but I didn't push. This was my journey, not theirs. The finest aspect? For the first time, I didn't feel the need to check my phone for my brother's opinion or anyone else, "s." This trip had been for me, and that realization was the real milestone. I had officially broken free from the narrative that I needed validation from someone who never believed in me to begin with. Update for the family meeting wasn't my idea, but my parents were adamant. They called me one evening saying it was time for us to sort things out as a family. My first instinct was to say no, but they were persistent. After some back and forth, I agreed to attend on one condition. There would be ground rules, no interruptions, no dismissive comments, and everyone would get a chance to speak. My parents reluctantly agreed, though I could sense my brother wasn't thrilled about the idea. When I arrived at their house, the atmosphere was tense. My brother was slouched on the couch, scrolling through his phone like he couldn't care less. My mom was floating around anxiously providing food and beverages to everyone while my dad sat calmly in the corner. I took a big breath and sat down, trying to preserve my cool. The encounter started uncomfortably. My parents attempted to ease into it by talking about how they wanted everyone to get along again. My brother rolled his eyes, grumbling that this was all a waste of time. But I maintained cool when it was my turn to speak. I described everything plainly and directly. I described how his relentless ridicule over the years had harmed me, using precise examples so there was no possibility for misinterpretation. I also talked about how the family's tendency to brush off his actions had made it tougher for me to speak up for myself. As I talked, my brother sat back in his chair, arms folded, a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. When I finished, he flew into full denial mode. He said he'd never meant anything malevolent, that I was overly sensitive, and that I should have just laughed it off like everyone else. He even accused me of making up stories to show him as the evil person for the first time. My parents didn't leap to his defense. Instead, my parents looked uncomfortable, and my dad actually stood out, stating that maybe my brother's jokes had gone too far. A look of rage distorted my brother's face. He began to yell, saying that everyone was banding together against him. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him before anybody could say anything more. The atmosphere changed once he departed. My dad shocked me by apologizing in private, but my mom appeared upset. He acknowledged that rather than ignoring the situation, he ought to have intervened years ago. Hearing those words felt like a minor win, even if it wasn't a complete settlement. In the weeks after the gathering, I never heard from my brother. To be honest, I didn't mind, even if it seemed like he had chosen to punish me with quiet. I poured myself into therapy, concentrating on re-establishing my boundaries and regaining my sense of self-worth. Every session felt like removing a fresh layer of the long-held self-doubt. In the meantime, I was working on a project with Claire, a fellow traveler I had met on my own journey. I was asked to join her team as a consultant for a cutting-edge adaptive technology project. The job was demanding but worthwhile, and it was incredible to be a part of something that had the potential to truly impact people's lives. At about the same time, I received an invitation to give a speech about overcoming obstacles and living with impairments at a nearby school. I was reminded of why advocacy had taken on such a significant role in my life by the kids' active participation and intelligent questions. My adventure wasn't the only one. Helping people see what was possible was the goal. However, not every member of the family was on board. Some extended family members began to mutter that I was exaggerating and making a huge fuss out of nothing. For the interest of maintaining family peace, one even advised me to simply let it go. I refrained from arguing. I just informed them that I had had enough of compromising my tranquility to ensure the family's comfort. I felt calmer than I have in years, even though the stress was still there. My life was developing in unexpected ways. My social circle was stronger than ever, my work was enjoyable, and I was no longer burdened with trying to win my brother's favor. Even though the family was split up, I felt entire for the first time. I wasn't living to please other people. I was leading a genuine life, and it was sufficient. Update 5. My brother sent me a lengthy, unexpected text message a few weeks following the family gathering. It felt more like a face-saving tactic than an apology, but it was his interpretation of one. He admitted that he might have gone too far, but he soon turned his attention to accusing our parents of failing to intervene sooner. "I hope we can move on and put this behind us," he wrote at the end of the message. It took me a while to respond. When I did reply, I realized that reconciliation would need more than a nebulous apology. I informed him that I wanted more than just words. I needed to see real responsibility and lasting change. His answer: quiet. At work, everything reached an all-time high around the same time. Not only was the project I had been working on with Claire's team a success, but I also received recognition for my contributions to adaptive technology from the industry. It was a weird award ceremony. I was pleased of the work we had done as I stood on stage, because I knew it had the potential to truly change people's lives. Shortly after, I received an invitation to give the keynote address at a significant innovation and accessibility event. The crowd was far bigger than I had anticipated, and I was totally unprepared for the standing ovation when I finished my presentation. In the finest manner possible, the acknowledgement was overwhelming. However, there were difficulties at the time. My parents excitedly shared the news in a family group chat, and my brother learned about the speech. He joked that he would need to pick up a new pastime to keep up with me, implying that I enjoyed the attention. There was no laughter this time. His remarks were unanswered by my parents, and the rest of the family's silence spoke more than words could. My parents privately reached out to show their pride. They informed me that they supported the boundaries I had established with my brother and expressed their admiration for my progress. It seemed like a change, a minor but important step in the direction of readjusting the dynamics inside the family. Claire and I, meantime, had been communicating. As we worked together on several projects and exchanged personal anecdotes, what had begun as a casual relationship deepened. Our relationship seemed like one of the most organic aspects of my journey, and she became into someone I could trust. The trophy and appreciation for my speech didn't end there. An article on local activists making a difference and a story on me were contacted by a community magazine. In addition to my professional accomplishments, the piece featured my advocacy efforts and personal narrative. It was a moment of introspection to see my journey mapped out like that. It made me realize how far I'd come in the midst of everything. Another clumsy attempt at reconciliation from my brother. I got a message from him asking if I wanted to meet up for coffee. He seemed to be merely checking a box rather than sincerely attempting to make amends, as seen by the invitation's lack of sincerity. I said that I had a busy schedule and declined. Although I didn't fully close the door, I did make it apparent that it would require patience and constant work to regain trust. Although it wasn't simple, it was essential to establish such boundaries. I had stopped being furious with him and was only concerned with keeping my peace. I was finally putting the lesson I had learned in therapy, that forgiving did not include putting up with harmful behavior, into reality. My parents also began to make adjustments. I never imagined that they would start going to family therapy sessions. They told me they wanted to address the enabling habits that had led to so much conflict over the years and better support both of their kids. I found closure in the knowledge that they were trying. I was unaware of my need. It was a struggle that proved to be the ultimate triumph. A demanding adapted marathon was what I had been training for. My brother had previously made fun of it as being impossible, but I was determined to prove myself and him incorrect, so I trained for months. Even though the race was difficult and tested my limitations, it was worth every second of struggle to reach the finish line. I had never encountered anything like the throng, applause, and sense of accomplishment prior to the marathon finish. Even attracted the interest of the local news, who included me in an article on conquering challenges. Friends, colleagues, and even complete strangers who had followed my journey sent me supportive messages. I came to a significant realization as I reflected on everything. My brother's remarks, the family gathering, and the accomplishments I had made. I no longer required his approval or affirmation. My tranquility, my accomplishments, and my strength come from inside, not from the views of others. I felt really free for the first time. I didn't set out to disprove my brother. I wanted to show myself that I could accomplish anything. I had Story 3. I am a 28-year-old woman who has been married to my 32-year-old husband, Andrew, for 2 years. Our relationship has been solid for the most part over the 6 years that we have been together. I feel really fortunate to have had Andrew in my life. He was kind and encouraging. However, one aspect of our life has been a continual source of pain for me since the beginning. His family. I quote, "V been treated as like I don't belong there, and it has only gotten worse with time. Our wedding was the first significant red flag. I had spent months organizing every aspect of the wedding, as many brides do, but Andrew's family appeared to believe that they should organize the celebration. Certain customs that didn't fit my concept were insisted upon being included. I first made concessions because I believed it was crucial to maintain harmony, but when they changed the caterer I had selected without informing me, things took a turn for the worst. Imagine discovering that the meal is entirely different from what you had planned when you get at your wedding." Andrew made an effort to patch things up, but it was obvious that his family didn't give a damn about how I felt. And it was only the start. The comparison began after our marriage. They weren't afraid to tell me that Andrew's family had always been close to his ex-girlfriend Claire. They would frequently mention in front of me that Claire was like a daughter to us. They mentioned her achievements, her culinary skills, or how deeply she had embraced family customs. I even heard Andrew's mother state to a cousin that Claire would have been a better fit for their family at one time. The holidays turned into yet another battleground. An unwritten law in Andrew's family was that all holidays, no matter what, were to be spent with them. They pretended that I had proposed calling off Christmas when I proposed switching between our families, or having a gathering at our place. To avoid upsetting my family, I continued to go along with it, even though they were subtly offended. Without realizing it, I would watch my parents celebrate each year, losing out on my own customs. When I made the decision to retain my maiden name after marriage, the name drama began. I wasn't attempting to offend anyone or make a statement. For me, it just seemed like the proper decision. However, Andrew's relatives didn't approve. They disregarded my choice, calling me by Andrew's last name whenever possible. Place settings for family gatherings, cards, and invites. When I gently corrected them, his last name appeared on all of them. They say they forgot or dismiss it as habit. Over time, the exclusion became increasingly obvious. I was never invited to family group chats, vacations, or trips, but Andrew was. Through a common friend, I learned that the family had gone to the beach without telling me about it. They undoubtedly thought he would inform me, but the pattern was obvious, according to Andrew, who didn't think it was a huge concern. I wasn't related to them. The supper came next. Andrew's parents asked us over for a family dinner a few months after we purchased our first house. I listened to them enthusiastically praising Claire all night long, even though I thought it could be a wonderful opportunity to bond. Andrew, quote, S mother, looked at me as if I was expecting me to take notes when she continued, "She used to make the best lasagna." Afterwards, they casually suggested that since I wasn't making enough money, Andrew must have paid for our house himself. For the record, Andrew and I split expenditures evenly and work full-time, but that didn't seem to suit their story. Soon after, the push to have children began. No matter how many times I maintained we weren't ready, the topic of when we would have a family seemed to come up in every conversation. It wasn't a conversation to them. It was ordered. I was accused of being self-centered or selfish when I resisted. Although Andrew made an effort to filter the chats, his strategy remained constant. Do not disturb the quiet. A weekend visit to their home was the tipping moment. I heard Andrew's mother chatting on the phone while I was in the kitchen. As though that was all I will ever be to them, she called me just the wife. Although it hurt, it gave me a fire. I became aware that I had been attempting to fit into a mold for years. My family had been a pillar of support during all of this, and I was never going to fill their shoes. They reminded me that I didn't know anyone and urged me to advocate for myself. I didn't say anything when I brought it up to Andrew. He said he would take care of it, but nothing ever came of it. I made the decision to stop going above and above at that point. To be honest, I was struck by a close friend's suggestion to let his family experience the consequences of their actions. Perhaps they should have given up trying so hard if they couldn't appreciate me as a member of the family. I began mentally cataloging methods to restore my harmony without resorting to plain rudeness. Retaliation wasn't the point. It had to do with limits. Although I knew it wouldn't be simple, I also knew that I couldn't continue to live this way. One update. I started with a straightforward action. I ceased reaching out to Andrew's relatives. I had been the one to arrange visits and send messages inquiring about their lives for years. I made the decision to stop this time to see what would happen. The silence was deafening, as might be expected. Weeks passed with not a single call or message. It was obvious that the relationship had never been sustained in either direction. As the holidays approached, I made yet another adjustment. When the subject of Easter came up, I decided I was done being the hostess, even though Andrew's family had grown accustomed to us hosting parties at our house. I told Andrew in passing that I had no interest in hosting this year. Despite his surprise, he decided to take care of it himself. I gave them a cordial welcome, assisted with their food, and then let Andrew handle the rest when his family arrived. By the end of the day, his mom was visibly annoyed, but I wasn't about to explain myself. The group chat was the next thing to shift. Andrew's family has this group chat where they share updates, plan events, and gossip about extended relatives. I had always tried to engage, sending cheerful replies and emojis, even when the conversation didn't interest me. This time I stopped participating altogether. I didn't leave the chat. I just let their messages pile up without responding. It didn't take long for someone to notice. One evening, Andrew mentioned that his sister had asked why I was being so quiet. I shrugged it off and changed the subject. Not long after, I heard through a friend that Andrew's family was planning a beach vacation. As usual, they didn't include me in the plans, and honestly, I didn't care. Instead of sulking, I decided to plan my own trip with a few close friends. We booked a cozy cabin in the mountains and spent a weekend hiking, cooking, and laughing until our stomachs hurt. I made sure to post plenty of pictures on social media, not to be petty, but to show that I was perfectly capable of enjoying my life without their approval. The next family dinner was another turning point. Andrew's parents invited us over and I decided to take a back seat. Normally, I try to steer conversations, engage with everyone, and keep things flowing. This time I stayed polite but distant, letting Andrew take the lead. When his mom brought up Claire again, the ex-girlfriend they can't seem to let go of, I didn't bite. I sipped my drink, nodded along, and redirected my focus to my plate. By the end of the night, I could tell Andrew was frustrated, but he didn't say anything. Then came his dad's birthday. For years, I had gone out of my way to pick thoughtful, personalized gifts for his parents. This time I forgot. We showed up with a card Andrew had picked out, and that was it. His mom made a comment about how I always used to bring such lovely gifts, but I just smiled and changed the subject. Andrew didn't even notice the hints from his mom started shortly after. She casually mentioned how nice it would be if someone planned a 4th of July barbecue this year. I pretended not to hear her when she repeated herself. I grinned and replied, "That does sound great." Then I switched back to my talk with Andrew's dad. The silence that followed was unpleasant, but I didn't let it worry me. Even when they asked me direct questions, I kept my replies brief and neutral. "How's work?" Got a basic, crowded but nice. "Any plans for the weekend?" Was met with, "Not sure yet." It wasn't nasty, but it was evident that I wasn't going to participate beyond the fundamentals. It didn't take long for Andrew to notice. One night he brought it up, claiming his family had noted I appear standoffish recently. I pointed out that I wasn't doing anything new from what they'd been doing to me for years. He didn't have anything to say to it. To hammer the lesson home, I started complimenting my own family more regularly. His mother made another passive-aggressive remark about how her family handles everything together at a dinner. I said nonchalantly how much I appreciated my folks' hospitality. I smiled and replied, "They're always so excited to include everyone." As the invites came in, the tension around the table was evident. I began to apologize and say, "No, we can't make it." This weekend became my standard reaction, so I didn't bother to elaborate. Rather, I devoted my time to activities that brought me joy. Hanging out with friends, spending time with my family, or simply unwinding at home. Eventually, the guilt tripping began. But it wasn't about me. Andrew's mother started phoning him to bemoan my growing distance and the harm it was causing to the family. Andrew, for once, did not immediately agree with them. He began to notice how frequently they made remarks that were obviously intended to discredit me or excluding me. Andrew was even told by one of their family acquaintances that I seemed to be subjected to more abuse from his parents than from anybody else. At last, Andrew acknowledged that his family's actions were troublesome. Although he was unsure of how to approach them, it was a beginning. I felt like we were in agreement for the first time in years. Update 2. I decided to have a modest dinner party a few weeks after I started my silent protests. However, I made it a point to do things differently this time. I invited only my parents' siblings and a few of Andrew's extended family members who had always been nice to me, rather than Andrew's whole family as I usually did. Although they weren't VIPs, Andrew's parents were present. They received the same informal last-minute invitation to their events that I always receive. The meal itself was straightforward but comforting. Everyone praised how comfortable and enjoyable the buffet I prepared seemed. Despite their rather tardy arrival, Andrew's parents seemed astonished to discover my family already comfortable and conversing. Although I gave them a courteous greeting, I didn't make an effort to make them feel special. Despite appearing to notice, Andrew remained silent the whole night. When one of Andrew's cousins said how much they valued being included, his mother continued to look around, presumably wondering why the typical throng wasn't present. The tight smile on his mother's face said it all. At about the same time, I began to send invites with greater purpose. I invited the family members I truly loved spending time with and excluded those who made things difficult when I wanted to organize or attend an event. The impact was instantaneous, and Andrew's parents weren't always on the list. Andrew was told by a relative that it was odd that his parents had not received an invitation to a family breakfast. Even though Andrew told me, I just shrugged. I stated that it was true that I intended to keep it small. In the meanwhile, over a family meal, Andrew began to take charge. His mother continued to make fun of me for not doing more to support family customs. Instead of being silent, Andrew spoke out this time. Calmly, he pointed out that I'd put on a lot of events and done things they didn't recognize. His mother's cheeks flushed, and she abruptly shifted the topic. It was a change, but not a major blowout. At last, Andrew was standing up for me in front of them. My perspective on gifting also evolved. I spent years choosing considerate presents for Andrew's family, but I came to the realization that they were never returned the favor. So I chose a generic card and candle for his mom's birthday. Not my typical over-the-top effort, but nothing nasty. In the meantime, I made a bespoke gift basket for Andrew's cousin, who had always been nice to me. During family get-togethers. Andrew's mother was notably displeased when the cousin bragged about it in front of everyone. I avoided contact with Andrew's parents. I wasn't unpleasant, but I also wasn't really amiable. Rather, I concentrated on meeting up with other family members, giving them a warm welcome, and making them feel important. In contrast, I had brief but courteous conversations with Andrew's parents. When his mother attempted to engage me in conversation, I responded in a brief and impersonal manner. She eventually gave up. The baby talk, particularly from Andrew's mother, kept coming up. She hinted at how eager she was to become a grandma. On this occasion, I deflected. Well, isn't that really up to Andrew? I murmured softly, shifting the focus to him. Taken by surprise. Andrew chuckled awkwardly and shifted the conversation. His mother was agitated, but I ignored it. The largest surprise occurred over a potluck meal with family. Making a dessert from scratch was my choice. Something straightforward but striking. A number of family members were talking about it by the end of the evening. When her casserole didn't receive the customary recognition, Andrew's mother, who typically brought the most impressive dish, was irritated. It was difficult to notice the change in focus, but I didn't boast or call attention to it. I also began to take back who I was. Despite my decision to retain my maiden name, Andrew's family had insisted on using his last name for me for years. I started using my real name when I signed cards and RSVPs. It was subdued yet powerful. Andrew's mother once inquired, "Did you forget something?" while holding up a card I had signed. "Nope," I responded with a smile. "That's my name." On social media, I started telling tales about my own relatives. I shared photos from special occasions with my brothers, dinners with my parents, and adorable time spent with my nieces and nephews. Without specifically addressing Andrew's family, the subtitles emphasized how encouraging and kind mine was. No one was unaware of the disparity. At last, Andrew began putting everything together. He acknowledged one evening that he was unaware of the amount of work I had to do to blend in with his family. He responded, "It's not fair, but I didn't see it before." He was obviously feeling bad, but I chose not to focus on it. I just reminded him that we both needed to make the shift. It bubbled over during the next family get-together. I was accused of splitting the family by Andrew's mother. Andrew held his ground this time. He emphasized that I had spent years attempting to close the gap and that the separation had existed for a long time before I did. As more family members became aware of the dynamic, they started to comment. Everyone was left in awkward quiet as Andrew's mother stormed off at the conclusion of the night. The consequence was revealing and nasty. A few family members discreetly came out to offer their assistance. Some even acknowledged that they had observed my treatment but had chosen not to intervene. In order to test if his family would take the message or intensify the situation further, Andrew and I decided to stand our position. Update 3. When Andrew's mother decided it was time for a family gathering, the repercussions began. One evening, she contacted Andrew and insisted that everyone must get together to ease the tension. Knowing I wasn't excited about the concept, Andrew reluctantly gave me the message. Nevertheless, I consented, reasoning that it would be better to make everything public. Andrew's parents were to host the gathering on a Sunday afternoon. The anxiety was high when we got there, with us on one side, and Andrew's father and she on the other. Andrew's mother had set up the seats as though they were in a courtroom. In between were Andrew's siblings, who were obviously uncomfortable but were attempting to appear unaffected. Andrew's mother jumped right into allegations at the beginning of the discussion. She said that I had caused a rift in the family by being aloof and passive-aggressive. She gave examples of how they weren't participating in the group chat, weren't invited to events, and weren't as enthusiastic as I used to be. It was obvious from her tone that she believed I was purposefully undermining family unity. I remained composed and just began enumerating my own instances. I brought up the fact that they had consistently compared me to Andrew's ex, disregarded my wishes at our wedding, and denied me access to holidays. I pointed out all the instances they had called me by the wrong name or questioned my judgment. I was accurate, not nasty. With every example, however, the room became notably quieter. Immediately, Andrew's mother entered a state of denial. She says she didn't know any of it had offended me and had just ever tried to be helpful. The majority of my comments were sidestepped by her, who claimed they were miscommunications or exaggerated. Andrew seemed noticeably stiff as she responded, "I didn't even know you felt this way." Andrew took over for the first time at that point. He confirmed what I said with a forceful and clear voice. He pointed out that the exclusionary and passive-aggressive remarks had been occurring for years. He claimed to have been attempting to maintain harmony, but it was clear that strategy was no longer effective. The ensuing hush was deafening. Andrew's mother's response was quick and dramatic. She broke down in tears and accused Andrew of abandoning the family by siding with me. She said she couldn't understand why I was attempting to turn him against her, when she'd always tried her best to welcome me. It was a full-blown emotional breakdown, complete with evasive references to everything that Mom had done for us and charges of ungratefulness. In an attempt to arbitrate, Andrew's father told her to calm down and implied that perhaps what I had said was true, which just made matters worse. With a gaze that might have melted steel, Andrew's mother accused him of putting strangers above family. One of Andrew's siblings then added that they believed I had a point and that I hadn't always received fair treatment from the family. The other sibling immediately defended their mother, claiming that I was exaggerating and attempting to create a commotion. A frenzied back and forth broke out in the room. Eventually, shouting over her shoulder that she was done trying and wouldn't spend her time on someone who didn't value her, Andrew's mother bounded out. Uncertain of what to do next, the rest of us sat there awkwardly, in a silent apology. Andrew's father promised to attempt to speak with her again later. Andrew and I analyzed everything at home after the meeting. Andrew acknowledged that he ought to have spoken up for me sooner, but he clarified that he had been worried about his parents' opinion. "I told you so, but I didn't emphasize it." He was obviously already criticizing himself for it. And the consequences didn't end there. Andrew's mother used social media over the course of the following several days to post ambiguous but clearly targeted remarks about entitled individuals and those who split families rather than bring them together. Although she didn't mention names, it was obvious who she was referring to. A few members of our extended family contacted me to ask for our perspective, but I didn't reply or interact. I stayed true to the facts and didn't say anything more. The last straw was when Andrew's mother said that unless I apologized, she would not go to any of my events. After discussing it, Andrew and I decided that we would not compromise our principles if she felt like having a fit. She made that decision. However, we refused to accommodate it. Even all the turmoil, there were a few bright spots. Some family members expressed their support by stating that they had observed my treatment and valued my composure in handling the situation. Even though he said he didn't know how to make amends, Andrew's father apologized in a private phone conversation for his wife's actions. Andrew and I made the decision to concentrate on upholding our limits and proceeding according to our own terms. We weren't going to give up our serenity any longer, regardless of whether his mother changed her mind. Although that wasn't the outcome I had hoped for, it was a positive move. A week following the disastrous family meeting, Andrew's father made a private contact. He apologized over the phone for the way I had been handled. He informed me that he had been thinking about everything and wanted to admit that things needed to change, even if he hadn't recognized the full scope of the problem until the meeting. Although I acknowledged his apologies, I made it plain that words alone were insufficient. Going future, actions would be more important. Not long after Andrew's assistance, a sibling stepped in as a mediator. They stated they were attempting to assist their mom understand my viewpoint when they contacted me individually to check in. Although I was grateful for the attempt, it was obvious that Andrew's mother wasn't prepared to take responsibility. Nevertheless, she showed up for a family BBQ, surprising everyone. Andrew's birthday was to be celebrated. Although she was unexpected, she avoided contact and only interacted with those who came close. It was a beginning, but it wasn't an olive branch. At the cookout, Andrew took the initiative once more and stood his ground when his mother made a passive-aggressive remark about how family used to be closer. "Closeness only works when everyone feels included and respected," he said without hesitation. After that, the topic of conversation swiftly changed, but it was obvious that he would no longer allow her to discredit me. Andrew and I had our very first Friendsgiving a few weeks later. My parents and a few of Andrew's extended family members were among the close friends and family members we invited. They invited his parents, but they turned them down. The occasion was a great success. The environment was lighthearted and enjoyable, and everyone helped out with food and beverages. My parents talked with Andrew's relatives, who candidly commended the relaxed and friendly atmosphere of the event. Images from the evening that showed a lively, contented bunch having fun together went viral on social media. It seemed like a watershed, evidence that we might develop our own customs and find happiness apart from the turmoil. Another exam was presented at the subsequent family get-together. Although her attitude had not altered much, Andrew's mother was present. This time, Andrew didn't put up with her making a few crude comments about how I had cut him off from his family's customs. Calmly, he reassured her that we were improving our balance and that nobody was being split apart. Although the conversation didn't get heated, she was clearly annoyed. I refused to participate in the back and forth and remained courteous. The change was noted by other family members. Andrew's cousin once praised my handling of the situation thus far, even mentioning how difficult it must have been for me to remain composed. I felt validated, since it was the first time someone had recognized the work I had been doing. When Andrew's mother heard, she didn't say anything, but she didn't appear happy. It was at this point that Andrew suggested family therapy. He believed it may assist with his mom's difficulties letting go of control and the underlying problems between us. She declined, predictably, describing it as theatrical and superfluous. I was hopeful that advancement might be made in other ways, though, because Andrew's father seems receptive to the concept. Additionally, Andrew's father began to intervene more frequently when his wife's actions became unacceptable. She subtly mentioned how difficult it must be for Andrew to balance marriage and family during one family meal. The tension was immediately reduced as Andrew's father swiftly changed the subject. Although it wasn't a big show, it demonstrated his attempt at more active mediation. The brother who had first spoken up for Andrew's mother also began to change his mind. In private, they acknowledged that they had been unaware of the extent of my exclusion over the years, and that it had been enlightening to hear my point of view in a meeting. Although it was a minor change, it seemed significant. Despite her continued resistance, Andrew's mother started to take baby steps toward inclusivity. She no longer went via Andrew to invite me to gatherings. Instead, she started doing it directly, but she still sounded hesitant. She even sought my opinion on a seating arrangement for a family meal, which was a first. It was something, but it wasn't passionate or warm. One of Andrew's relatives had a big family gathering where the genuine breakthrough occurred. It's becoming late at night. Andrew, quote, "S mother needs assistance with some last-minute planning. I discreetly stepped in to help, making sure everything went without a hitch." She thanked me later, in front of a family gathering. Even though it was a straightforward "thank you for your assistance," it seemed significant coming from her. After a little period of silence, Andrew squeezed my hand beneath the table. Although it wasn't a complete reconciliation, it was the first time my contributions were acknowledged in public. Even though we knew his mom still had a long way to go, Andrew and I agreed by the end of the night that things were getting better. However, the minor triumphs were sufficient to maintain our optimism. Given how easily things may go back to way they were, we also decided to continue to be watchful of our limits. It seemed like we were finally coming around a bend when we looked back. It was no longer the elephant in the room, but the tension was still there. In years, for the first time, I thought there was some development, even if it was modest. Update 5. Andrew and I had a private retreat to a lakeside cottage last month to commemorate our 3rd wedding anniversary. There were no family dramas or other distractions, and it was just the two of us. Andrew thanked me for being there for him through everything as we toasted marshmallows by the fire. He acknowledged that it wasn't until things began to change that he recognized how much I had been through. It was a brief but significant moment that served as a reminder of how far we had come together as a team back home. While my mother-in-law wasn't flawless, the relationship with Andrew's family had changed considerably. Not at all. There was a noticeable improvement in her demeanor. She had been trying to talk to me and even asked me to join her and some of her family for lunch. It was a step toward politeness, even though it wasn't quite warm and cuddly. Her remarks were less scathing at family get-togethers, and she appeared to consider her words before speaking. I was so relieved to see that she had completely ceased talking about Andrew's ex. I became closer to Andrew's encouraging sibling as well. They turn into a silent ally who frequently intervenes on my behalf when we are having family conversations. When a family member made a joke about my choice to use my maiden name at one event, the sibling immediately brought up how common and accepted that option was in the modern day. Not overlooked, it was a little yet affirming gesture. Andrew, quote, "S father remained a mediator. Whenever my mother-in-law appeared to be about to say anything sarcastic, he would skillfully reroute the discussion. He even gave me praise for a dessert I took to a recent meal, directing the discussion in a more light-hearted direction. He was obviously doing his hardest to maintain harmony without taking sides. When Andrew and I made the decision to try couples counseling, it was one of the most unexpected twists. With all the baggage from the previous several years, we wanted to make sure we were on the same page going ahead. The sessions opened my eyes. They provided us with skills to improve our communication and assisted us in processing what had transpired. According to Andrew, he felt as though he had at last figured out how to put our marriage first without feeling bad about his family. For us both, it was a breakthrough. Once a continual source of conflict, holidays have become more balanced. After deciding that we both felt okay about it, Andrew and I began switching off the holidays between our families. Last Christmas, everything went more smoothly than I had anticipated. We spent the morning with his family and the evening with mine. Andrew's father made sure the day remained light and happy, while my mother-in-law kept her remarks to herself. For everyone, including social media, it seemed like a victory. It had calmed down after being a battlefield for passive-aggressive posts. My mother-in-law started sharing photos of her garden and family pets, instead of expressing nebulous criticisms of specific individuals. It appears that she had finally come to the conclusion that voicing her complaints in public was not strengthening her position. Meanwhile, members of the extended family started contacting them to offer their support. Family members sent me a few texts expressing their gratitude for my self-defense and positive example. However, the alterations went beyond bounds. They aimed to establish a new benchmark for how family connections may function. Andrew and I made it a point to provide an example of positive relationships by demonstrating that open communication and respect for one another were essential. It seems to be getting on gradually. Gatherings became less stressful, and other family members began to speak up more when anything felt unjust. Andrew was my best supporter through it all. Even though it seemed like his family was only meeting me halfway, he would frequently praise me for the work I did to try to improve relations with them. He also promised to do better in the future, and made sure I understood how much he valued the early sacrifices I had made. His sincere appreciation gave me the impression that our marriage had really taken a turn for the better. Even though she was still hesitant to apologize directly, my mother-in-law started to show me more respect. She even requested my input on a trip concept she was preparing over a big family meal. Although it wasn't much, it demonstrated that she was beginning to accept me as a member of the family. It seemed like a little triumph, one that resulted from maintaining my boundaries rather than pressuring the matter. In retrospect, the path has not been simple. There were times when I wanted to quit up because everything seemed too much to bear. However, having Andrew support me and sticking up for myself made all the difference. It changed our marriage as well as my friendship with his family. Together, we became stronger, closer, and more assured of the life we were creating. The strength of self-advocacy is the most important lesson I've learned. Establishing boundaries is crucial for your well-being, but it may be difficult, particularly when dealing with family. I hope this tale inspires you to stand your ground if you find yourself in a similar circumstance. Winning isn't always the goal. Sometimes it's about making room for development and respect for one another. Although they aren't flawless, our family dynamics are improved now, and for now, that's plenty.